right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Rosewood Academy Leadership Live for July. I am Antonio Liga, as you guys know. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Fubara. So we'll kind of go over it a little bit after kind of going into our theme. But first, we always start with our why. So our why is to multiply the blessings and opportunities that have been put into our trust. And so our why, we like to share it with our Tuesday morning meetings and our leadership lives. So next time we have one of those, we would like to do some kind of gifts or raffles on those. So we'll make sure we call on some people to participate on that. And so for Q3, we're going to go over overcoming challenges. And for July, we have acceptation, leadership, and crisis. And for that session, we have Dr. Fubara. Have you guys known he has been our right-hand man on these leadership lives? He's helped us tailor the courses, as well as picked out the specific professors, guests to host those and participate on those and to present those topics. And so for this one, the floor is yours, Dr. Fubara.
All right. Good morning. Thank you, Antonio, for the introduction. And it's always a pleasure to participate with you all at the Rosewood Family of Companies on these Leadership Live webinars. So thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. And it's a learning opportunity for me and ultimately for my students as well. These conversations help us all to grow. So thank you so much. Antonio mentioned the previous quarters and the themes, and I actually have my pin. I was going to wear it, but I didn't want to put a hole in the shirt. So I should have worn a different shirt, so I put a hole in it.
You got a pin. I don't.
Oh, shoot. Antonio, is that Timothy? I think you need to do a little work, Antonio. So again, as was introduced, the theme for today, the theme for this month, is adaptive leadership in crisis. So let's go to the next slide. So when you think about crisis, have you ever faced, and oh, I should have mentioned this in the introduction, I really hope you guys will interact on this presentation, and that you will you can either use the chat or unmute yourself and respond. So these are not rhetorical questions. So I really hope to hear from you all throughout this presentation. So first question, have you ever faced a situation that was totally new to you? A situation that presented unprecedented challenges where previous expert solutions could not be applied. So think about that for a second. So a totally new situation, and a situation where your expertise or the previous expertise of others could not be applied to that situation. So again, this is not a rhetorical question. So can some of you speak up? Parenting, yes. If you may have had cats or dogs before, but when you start parenting, it's a whole new thing. I think COVID provided this across the board. Absolutely, COVID for sure. Absolutely. Let's hear a few more. And then again, these could be personal or business. So thank you for mentioning parenting, which is not a business issue, but it definitely a personal issue that many of us have faced. A couple more. Dealing with loss, absolutely. And we all deal with loss in different ways, and it hits us differently and it impacts us differently. So yeah, it's really hard to program. Taking care of sick parents. I did a little of that. Both of my parents are gone now, but my sister did most of the caregiving, but it's tough. It's definitely tough. One more. Get one more. Maybe something in the business, an unprecedented situation, or yeah, an unusual situation.
Dr. Fubara, I will say when I
this is very back in the beginning. Joining Chandler with purchasing the assets of the former company out of bankruptcy that is now Provantage. That was a brand new experience, and at the time I didn't know what merchandising was. So yes, it was a very, very new experience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I can imagine you telling your friends, we're going into the merchandising business. And they say, what's that?
They're like, what is that? Yes. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Antonio, let's go to the next slide. So this is kind of a follow-up to the first question. So what behaviors and or leadership characteristics worked well to bring you successfully through that period? This is really previewing what adaptive leadership is about. So the webinar is called Adaptive Leadership in Crisis. So in a crisis, what skills, what characteristics, even what personal characteristics did you see? And then the follow-up question to that, or the second part, did you adapt any new habits that have persisted beyond that time? So I see people have already started answering. Layoffs, I'm assuming that's the answer to the first question. Leaving the company unexpectedly. Some of the characteristics that helped you get through. So transparency, honesty, communication, being resourceful, thinking outside the box, absolutely. Teamwork, thank you. Teamwork, making the dream work. Being adaptable, being open to new approaches, identifying root causes and searching for answers, agility, being communicative. Thank you. And as you will see, so this is already half of the adaptive leadership presentation. You guys have already presented half of it. Many of these things that you have pointed out are the tools and characteristics for adaptive leadership: flexibility, resourcefulness, new habits, patience. Yes. There's an anecdote about the man who asked the Lord to give him patience, and then the Lord set some terrible situations. And he said, this is not exactly what I had in mind. But we learn patience in those challenging situations. I'm glad people mentioned COVID too, because I think that's the sort of the ultimate unprecedented, unexpected, never before seen situation that impacted all of us. And as the question said, the expertise didn't really apply. I mean, the experts had never seen this before, so they couldn't just pull out tool number 4 and apply it. And so, as you guys mentioned here, things like transparency and flexibility and learning, letting go of control, these were things that were really necessary in order to deal with COVID. Let's go to the next slide, Antonio. Here's an example of a person dealing with an unprecedented situation and applying some adaptive leadership. So you may have heard the story before of a man named Moses, who was assigned to lead a group of people, thousands of people, out of an oppressive situation. And literally, they were walking out of that oppressive situation and got to a point where they were facing a sea, a literal sea. And there's an army chasing them down and trying to oppress them, maybe kill them. And Moses is leading thousands of people. He's never done this before. And in front of him is a body of water that they cannot swim through, they cannot wade through, they cannot get through. And so this is literally a crisis situation. It's unprecedented. His previous skill set would not apply here. If you know the story, in previous situations, Moses had given speeches basically to the king to say, "Let my people go." He was sort of a political leader in that sense. But in this situation, his previous skill set saying let my people go would not work. And even sort of the miraculous things that he had seen before this would not work. And so Moses was forced to adapt, to find new solutions, to be flexible. And later on, we see where the skill set, the faith that was developed at this point, helped him with future leadership challenges. So again, this is a kind of a big story of adaptive leadership. Let's go to the next slide. He was kind of like Anthony Fauci in an adaptive leadership situation. So a lot of what I'm using in this webinar comes from this book called The Practice of Adaptive Leadership by Heifetz and Linsky. And Heifetz and Linsky and some of their other colleagues have done a lot of work on adaptive leadership. There's probably 4 books, several articles written by these guys, and other people have drawn from their work in other writings and books and articles on adaptive leadership. So the quotations that you'll see in this presentation come from this book, but I've also used some of their other material as well to prepare this presentation. So let's go on. So this is a quote. It's a longer quote. Don't panic. I don't have any more that are this long, but I thought this was really good. And so let's kind of walk through this a little bit here. So as it says, adaptive challenges are not amenable to authoritative expertise. Although people might hope that if the right subject matter expert could only be found, these problems could be solved. Let me pause there for a minute. Again, if you think about COVID, if you think about somebody mentioned parenting or losing a loved one, you have people who have subject matter expertise, but their expertise just doesn't solve the problem. All of the people at the NIH and the Centers for Disease Control and the Ministries of Health, really didn't know what to do with COVID. And so, again, it's a real unprecedented, I hate to keep using that word, but an unprecedented situation. These are what we call adaptive challenges, gaps generated by bold aspirations and challenging realities. For these, the world needs to build new ways of being and responding beyond the current repertoires of available know-how. So some of that second set, or the second couple of sentences there, some of that's getting into crises that are not really emergencies per se, but crises nonetheless that are turning points or major change points in the history or in the life of a family, the life of in your case, the life of a corporation. And so we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But so a crisis situation doesn't have to be an emergency or a situation of loss, but it could just be a serious turning point. Let me give a quick example. So I work in higher education, and higher education right now is really at a crisis point. It's not an emergency per se, it's not COVID, but there are a lot of things that are impacting us. There are people in the public who think that college degrees are a waste of time. There are complaints about student loans and the high price of college education. And of course, whenever there's a discussion about the high price of college education, I stop talking because that's where my check comes from. That it's a serious situation, and people are starting to kind of rumble about it in our public arena. And you also have the fact that in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, people didn't have as many babies. So in the next few years, there won't be as many 18-year-olds enrolling in college. So again, we are in a crisis situation, even though it's not really an emergency situation, it is a crisis. And I don't know what your business is facing. All the indications that I get from talking to you all at Rosewood is that everything is great, but I suspect that there are some surprises down the road or things that you're thinking about that could present these sort of crisis situations. So let me keep going. So what is needed from a leadership perspective are new forms of improvisational expertise, a kind of process expertise that knows prudently how to experiment with never been tried before relationships, means of communication, and ways of interacting that will help people develop solutions that build upon and surpass the wisdom of today's experts. And some of what you talked about on that previous question, we talked about flexibility and adaptability and letting go of control and new habits. I mean, that's really implied in that expression there. I love that phrase, improvisational expertise. You know, if you think about playing jazz, you know, jazz is improvisational music. But you can't just jump up and start playing it, you know, with no skill at all. You have to have pre-existing skill, but then you apply it in a way that is new. And that's what we're talking about with adaptive challenges. Let's go on. So one of the definitions of adaptive leadership, that is the practice of mobilizing people to tackle tough challenges and thrive. So adaptive leadership is specifically about change that enables the capacity to thrive. So let me pause there for a second. What do you think about when you think about thriving? So the concept actually comes from biology. When you think about a creature or a some kind of animal, thriving is, you know, when they are doing well, or even when the species is doing well, or when a certain population of animals is doing well. But what does thriving look like for us as a business, as individuals? Maybe I should put on my glasses. It might help me read this screen here. Maintaining, didn't help. So thriving, on my screen, there's bubbles that are popping up on top of the chat, so I can't quite read them, Antonio. Making a cohesive
team that works together, making things happen, being able to invest in other people, hiring, creating new positions.
Okay, keep going. Read a few more of those for me.
Rising to the occasion, creating opportunity, seizing opportunities as they appear.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Couple more.
Being more creative and innovative. Becoming more creative and innovative. There you go. Servant leadership.
Good, good. Funny enough, nobody said making more money, which I would think that would be part of thriving. Scott, I hope that's on the menu when you think about thriving. Absolute. Thank you, guys. These are great. And of course, for a organization, you have your KPIs. I would assume that also is part of what you think about when it comes to thriving. Somebody said being resilient and showing and having stability. So being able to persist for the long term. I think that's a great point. That goes without saying. Yes, that's why you didn't say it. Making money is part of thriving. Thank you, Antonio. Let's keep going. Well, I'm sorry. Actually, let's go back again to that definition for a second. So again, adaptive leadership is the practice of mobilizing people to tackle tough challenges and thrive. So it's about change that enables the capacity to thrive. Remember what I said about higher education. As we think about the future of higher education, we are facing, as I said, a crisis, even though it's kind of a quiet crisis, but we want to be able to thrive in the future, which means educating more students, continuing to offer new programs, continuing to turn out new research, making sure our students are able to get jobs. I mean, all of those kinds of outcomes that are important to us. And so adaptive leadership is about making sure that we can continue to do that. Okay, you can keep going. So one more definition, leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. So Todd Bolsinger writes mostly to churches and nonprofits. So this is a slightly different perspective, but I think it's an interesting idea that adaptive or leadership in general is about helping people transform so that they can transform others. And I think for you guys as a company that is founded and or rooted in certain values, that even though this statement is targeting sort of nonprofits, I think it's relevant to you all as well, that you want people to transform so that they can go out and transform. And so it's more than just making money. It's more than just, you know, adding new customers or building a business, but it's really making a difference in a holistic sort of way. Let's go on. All right, a couple more quotes from the book. Says there's no reason to exercise leadership or to take a risk on a new idea unless you care about something deeply. So Heifetz and Linsky suggest that only people who care about the organization are going to engage in adaptive leadership. So there's kind of a challenge for you all as members of the Rosewood family of companies. Do you care about the organization? And that may be sort of a challenging question in 2024 because people are a lot more cynical about work and about their jobs and about corporations, and they feel like, well, you know, I'm going to give them the bare minimum. You've got, you know, the whole phenomenon of quiet quitting, and a lot of people just, you know, are unwilling to invest into their employer or their corporation or even a church or a civic organization in a way that says that I care about the future of this organization. But you know, if you don't care, it's going to be difficult for you to engage in real leadership. You know, it's easier to just kind of do your job, get your check, and go home. So there's a challenge here for you. And I might go as far as to say, if you don't care about the organization, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this has not been approved by the staff and management of the Rosewood family of companies. But if you don't care about the organization, maybe you should go work somewhere else. Okay, that's just me. Let's go on. So one more quote: a challenge for adaptive leadership is to engage people in distinguishing what is essential to preserve from the organization's heritage from what is expendable. Successful adaptations are thus both conservative and progressive. So we're holding two things in tension. Adaptive leadership is in a much of it is about managing change and managing transformation. But in any transformation, we've got to hold on to who we are. So we're never going to change everything. And so, as it says, it's both conservative and progressive. We are holding on to what makes us who we are. We're holding on to the core. We're also looking toward the future and looking to change. I'm actually on the team, the search committee. So Campbell is going to be bringing on a new president next year. And I actually happen to be one of the 12 or so people that's on the search committee. So if any of you want to apply, just, you know, send $100 bills to me. But, you know, that's going to be one of the challenges for the next president of Campbell, right? How does he prepare us for the future? He or she, sorry, prepare us for the future and at the same time preserve who we are. And obviously for you all as a corporation, you have some deep-seated values and principles that you abide by, that you want to hold on to, but also things that you're going to have to change. So next slide, please. All right, so adaptive leadership, of course, is about adaptation. And some of the characteristics of adaptation, it occurs through experimentation. So trying new things. And we'll talk more about this, but, you know, trying new things means some things are not going to work. Adaptation relies on diversity. So here we're not talking about diversity in terms of race, gender, or religion. We're talking about diversity in terms of different perspectives. And it's impossible to keep doing the same thing or to only have one perspective and to adapt or change or transform. And so we've got to hear different voices. We've got to hear different perspectives in order to adapt. So diversity here again is diversity of thought, diversity of ideas and perspectives. New adaptations significantly replace, regulate, and rearrange the old or some old DNA. This goes back to what I said a minute ago. There are some things about us that are going to change, some things about Rosewood that will have to change, some things that are core and have to stay the same. So there's some, again, replacing, regulating, and rearranging that's going to take place. I think there's a couple more bullets here. Adaptation takes time. So much of what we're talking about here, some of the ideas that we're talking about today might take 2 or 3 years to roll out. And some of the examples that I've read about, corporations that have taken literally years to transform, but they were consistent and persistent about making the transformation happen, even though it may have taken quite a bit of time. Is that the last one? Oh, so here's a question. Yeah, you may. I was trying to decide if this is a rhetorical question, but let me ask if anybody wants to comment on this question. So in a crisis, which aspects of the organization should we keep and which should be changed? So you may want to answer this generally as opposed to specifics, like we should keep Chandler and get rid of Scott. But I'm sure there's some things that we want to change. So keep the ones that work. There's a good answer. Can you be more specific? Which things actually work? Because they work today, but they might not work in the future. In fact, if I can digress for a little bit, we'll talk about this a little more, but organizations actually operate in such a way that they preserve the things that work today and the skills and the people that work today, but they may not work tomorrow. So somebody said, keep the core values. Don't forget who we are. I would agree with that. I think that's something that's not going to change. Some of it depends on the culture of the crisis. Keep core values and principles. Yes, we'll talk a little more about that as well. I think people on both sides of what should be kept and what should be changed. It speaks to our earlier point about aligning with our values. Yes. So generally, core values don't change often, right? They will change over time, but not often. And it takes a lot of thought and a lot of deliberation before we start changing core values. But yeah, those are things, and some of them will never change. Yeah, so I agree with the respondents here. Let's go to the next slide. So another quote from Heifetz and Linsky. So the most common cause of failure in leadership is produced by treating adaptive challenges as if they were technical problems. So one of their themes, you'll see this in a lot of their writing, is this idea that there's a difference between adaptive challenges and technical problems. So let's go to the next slide. I think I have more on that on the next slide. There we go. So if you've ever seen the TV show House, anybody ever seen it? If you've ever seen the TV show House, it's about a medical team who helps that helps people who are dealing with like really serious illnesses that the doctors can't figure out. And so the reason why it's relevant here is that physicians generally deal with technical problems. They have a set of expertise, they have a set of skills, they have training, and they know what to do when they see certain patterns. So if this person has a fever and this particular blood level has changed and this indicator is up, then that means, oh, this person probably has an infection. We should treat it with antibiotics. Or, if this person comes in and they do an x-ray and they have a bone break in the bone that looks a certain way, oh, this one doesn't need surgery, we just need to put a cast on it. So they have these patterns that they've seen before. They have this expertise, and it's very high level. So these are technical problems. They're based on previously seen conditions and previously used expertise. So they're technical and repeated. They're still high level and really important, but they're not adaptive challenges. So what House and his team typically deal with in the show are adaptive challenges. Somebody's sick and they've never seen this before, or the sickness is not responding to the typical treatment. And then they start asking questions. Well, have you been to Bora Bora recently? Or, have you lived with somebody who had this particular issue? Or do you have a cat that's got blah, blah, blah? And in some cases, they actually go to the person's house, the person's home, and walk around the home to see if there's some chemicals or animals, or, is there something in their environment that might be causing this? Or did they travel to a certain place or hang out with certain people that may have caused this? So they're going way off the map in terms of finding a solution to fit these problems. And again, Antonio, go back to that previous slide. As it says, the challenge is to recognize when you're dealing with an adaptive issue or an adaptive challenge, and to know that it's more than a technical problem. Our previous skills, our previous expertise are not going to fix this. Right? COVID is different from the flu and malaria and the other things that we've dealt with. It's not the common cold, even though there's a lot of similarity. It presented all kinds of challenges, not just from a disease standpoint, but also from a social and political standpoint and an economic standpoint as well. So let's go on. So again, they're challenging people to see the difference between adaptive, keep going, and technical solutions, or adaptive versus technical problems. So a couple of things here about the difference between the two. I alluded to this earlier. So if you have an authority role, you are generally expected to keep things within the boundaries established by those who authorized you. So one of the challenges of trying to exercise adaptive leadership is that all of us who have jobs, we were hired to do a certain thing, and we were hired within a certain context. So the people who hired us expect us to operate within a certain sphere. And adaptive challenges by nature require us to step outside of those boundaries. So as the second bullet says, however, adaptive leadership requires pushing things beyond those boundaries. It is not just uncomfortable, it can be perilous. You can get fired for pushing beyond the current boundaries. It could cost the company money. In some cases, people could physically get hurt when we push beyond the current boundaries. And that house example, again, is TV. But I mean, when they come up with an adaptive solution to these problems, sometimes they're doing really weird things. We're going to harvest the venom from this spider, and we're going to use it, mix it with the hormones from a horse. They're going way off the map, and so it could be actually dangerous. We may try multiple technical solutions, but they don't work, and that's really an indicator that this is an adaptive challenge. Again, like with COVID, people tried a lot of familiar things, and then it ultimately had to start trying some unfamiliar and unusual things. There was a lot of guessing. There was a lot of frustration because we didn't know. People, the experts didn't have simple answers for us. But that's the nature of an adaptive challenge. So I asked the question here at the bottom, can you think of a problem you have tried to fix multiple times and failed multiple times or numerous times? That's an example of an adaptive challenge. So anybody want to share? I know this could be a little embarrassing, but any examples here?
I guess a fun fact going on your house and theories and the show. And I don't want to ruin the show for everybody, but if you watch every episode, it takes 3 tries. On the third try, they figured it out. So talking about patterns and everything, it's every third diagnosis they get it right, but the first and second are always wrong. But yeah, so that's a little fun fact on the show House.
Thank you, Antonio. I've never noticed that, but it makes the point here, right? They tried to fix it multiple times. They tried their technical expertise, and ultimately, it takes it's something fresh and new. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
One of the hardest things about web development and stuff is like having a bug that's hard to fix, and sometimes you do have to kind of look at it over the course of a couple of days, or maybe even, it might be something that takes months to kind of figure out how this is happening and stuff. So you learn to deal with a lot of failure when you kind of engage in that stuff.
No, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? In my context, one of the things we're seeing is that, as I said, higher education is changing. Another change that's taking place in higher ed is that people really like, especially our graduate students, really like online learning. And so for a long time, we thought, yeah, online is just kind of a little added extra, we didn't want to be associated with some of the, for-profit schools that did a lot of online learning. And here we are today, right? Some of that, of course, was propelled by COVID, or accelerated by COVID. But, today, more and more of our students, especially in the MBA program, want to learn online. And we're offering our Trust and Wealth Management program, our Master of Trust and Wealth Management online. That's unprecedented, right? And it was resisted for a long time. But the context has changed, and fortunately, some of the skills that we learned during the pandemic, so some of the remote learning skills that we had to learn quickly now are helping us going forward. I mentioned that at the beginning, that one of the positives about crisis is that we can learn some things that can help us longer term. Let's keep going. So adaptive leadership can be described as a process of observation, interpretation, and intervention. And you see here it's a cycle, so it happens over and over again. Let's keep going. I think I'm running short on time here. So it says, what observations must you ask to get a good picture of the situation? And what differences will you see if you are on the balcony instead of the dance floor? So Heifetz and Linsky have this metaphor that I think is fantastic of getting on the balcony. You can go on to the next slide, Antonio. So they talk about the fact that if you are up on the balcony at a dance, that you see things from a very different perspective. And some of the things that you might have missed if you were down on the floor dancing, you see while you're up on the balcony. And one of the examples they mentioned is that maybe you notice that everybody is moving to one side of the room when the music comes on. And you realize that they're moving away from the speakers in the room because the music is too loud. And you never would have noticed that if you were on the floor dancing. But when you get up on the balcony and look down at the dance, you see things from a different perspective. They actually, in the book, they also shout out Magic Johnson, Michigan State University's own, Lansing, Michigan's own, for being a basketball player. I realize now that I'm getting older that some of you may not know who Magic Johnson is, but he was a really fantastic point guard and literally could see the whole floor even while he was playing the game. My mother used to say that he would pass the ball to his own guys and it would hit them in the face because they didn't see what he saw as he was scouting the floor. Anyway, that's a metaphor for our organizational lives. As the slide mentions here, the single most important skill and most undervalued capacity for exercising adaptive leadership is diagnosis. So this is part of that observation process we're talking about. It's being able to step back and look at the big picture, right? What's really happening? And as it says on the slide here, that includes diagnosing the system and diagnosing ourselves, which involves asking ourselves some hard questions. What am I doing in this situation, in this system? Am I helping to make things better or worse? And, what's the view? My wife uses the phrase, what's the view from Mars? So if you could step back, way back, and look at the situation, what do you see? And as the slide here mentions, it's an iterative process. Try one thing. If it doesn't work, try something else. That goes back to what I said about experimentation earlier. Let's keep going. So the second step in that loop is interpretation. So what is the meaning of what you observe? You see something, now understand what it means. And as it says, keep in mind that there are multiple possible meanings, and your initial ideas could be wrong. So, you have to look again, right? Why is it that our customers are rejecting this product, right? We have the observation, we see they're not buying this thing, but what's the reason behind it? And let's not make, quick assumptions about it. I work with a medical center, a nonprofit medical center, and the turnover is incredible. People come, they work for 2 weeks, they work for 3 weeks, they'll quit. People will apply, schedule an interview, and never show up. And so it's just the weirdest situation. I have a friend who owns a childcare center and has some of the same issues where people will apply for jobs and not show up for the interview, or show up, work for 2 weeks, and quit. And so it's this kind of persistent, nagging problem. And, we can observe the problem, but now the question is why? What's going on? Why is this happening? And so as it says here, it may take multiple reviews of the problem to figure out what's wrong. Let's keep going. I think part of interpretation is also helping other people interpret the situation. So as it says here, people don't really hate change, they hate loss. They need to see the benefit of the change. So again, adaptive leadership is about transformation, it's about change. And part of the interpretation process is helping people interpret what this change means and hopefully help them see the benefits of it, help them see the positives. So give them a more comprehensive interpretation, if you will. I said this earlier, organizations are designed to function the way they currently do. So changing people requires both rational and emotional triggers. People are used to working the way they work. And somebody brought that point up earlier that, we have things that work, but yeah, they're designed to work the way the organization currently works, but not for the future of the organization. Here's another piece of when you're helping people deal with change. So consider what people stand to lose if the change happens. They may not be willing to articulate it, but help them deal with the loss. So this is kind of thinking deeply about the people that you're asking to change, right? What do they have to give up in order to change? And as it says, they may not be willing to say it out loud. I love the fact that I have this big office. And if we change the structure of the business school, I might have to move to a smaller office, right? I'll sound petty if I bring that up. So I probably won't say anything, but I'll be annoyed nonetheless, right? And so that's, there are people in your organization who have the same sort of concerns about change. What am I going to lose? And so they may not say it out loud. We have to try to help to think about what they're going to lose and what they're not going to like about the change. as it says, consider the competing values people have. They might be losing in one regard, but you can point out the win. So as you're helping them interpret the situation, help them see that there are positives. Okay. Let's go a little further, and I'll pause for questions in just a minute. So another quote from the book: in any organization of human beings, people will tend to glom onto interpretations of reality that do not require them to take personal responsibility for the problem, right? So oftentimes when people are interpreting what's going on, they're blaming the economy. Oh, it's the bosses. The people love to blame the bosses, bosses. And when we were not bosses, those of you who are bosses now, you probably did it too, right? It's the top management. They don't understand what we're going through. Or maybe top management is pointing at other people and saying, they don't understand the challenges that this organization faces. So people rarely want to take responsibility for the problem themselves. And, part of the interpretation process is asking, diagnosing yourself. Could it be that I'm part of the problem? Let's keep going, Antonio. We're running a little short here. So finally, intervention is doing something about the problem. So one of the questions is on the second bullet: what can you realistically accomplish? So we're not trying to be, pie in the sky. You're not going to change the world, especially if you're not the CEO of the company. You can have an impact on the organization, but it's going to be a limited impact just by virtue of your position in the organization. The third bullet: don't be afraid to try things outside of your comfort zone. So part of the whole theory behind adaptive leadership is that everybody in the organization can make change. Everybody can trigger change, but it's going to require you to step out of your comfort zone, to ask some hard questions, to say some hard things. Fourthly, to experiment. And their advice is that when we do experiment, to go all in on our experiments, but at the same time recognize that we could be wrong. So try something new. Maybe you can find a small kind of demo to try it on. Do it, intently and intensively. But if it doesn't work, move on to something else. You might have to speak the unspeakable. So one of the principles of adaptive change is that everybody's willing to speak up when they see things that need to be changed, even if it's uncomfortable, all right, even if it's out of the norm. And here one other idea here. So difficult issues need to be ripe before people are ready to change them. If not, we can work to ripen them, but ripening the issue is not the same as addressing it. So ripening an issue means to help people see that it's a concern, right? Because sometimes the crisis is not obvious. Like the example that I mentioned from higher education, it's not obvious that we are facing a long-term crisis, or as I said, a kind of a quiet crisis in higher education. So people need to ripen it and remind everybody that, hey, we can't keep doing what we've been doing. We've got to think of new things. We've got to be creative. We've got to be innovative in the future. And I suspect that's true for you all as well. That even if you're not facing an immediate sort of monster challenge, you still have to be thinking about what's next and what we need to adapt for the future. Next slide, please. Let's keep going. I'm running late on time, so some advice for actually. Oops, not that one. Go back. There we go. So some advice for actually accomplishing adaptive change is you need partners, other people in the organization who will get on board with your ideas. So talk to people. Listen, and of course for leadership, listen to people is a big lesson as well. Adaptive change happens through distributed leadership. By definition, nobody has all the answers when it comes to an adaptive challenge. And so we have to listen to people, in some cases, people who may say things that are weird or unorthodox, or they may say it the wrong way. So maybe they have a good idea, but they're not articulate in expressing it. They say it in a way that sounds rude or a little off. Obviously we don't tolerate rudeness and we don't want people to be rude or disrespectful. But in some cases, people just don't know any better and they say something that sounds crazy, but it's actually a good idea. Let's keep going. Adaptive change often involves changing the organization's culture. So one of the things we ought to think about is what aspects of the culture or structure are helpful and what things are not so helpful. So here at Campbell, we used to have real top-down sort of culture, right? Our former presidents were sort of militaristic, sort of autocratic, and they were good men, but they were, it was their way or the highway. And so that culture sort of pervaded the rest of the university. But our current president, I think helped to usher in a new culture where people are more willing to speak up and it's less autocratic. Let's keep going. Can you think of new cultural norms that will improve your organization's performance? So again, we're running out of time, but think about what shapes the culture or what illustrates the culture of an organization. So one of the items on here is group norms and then meeting protocols. So are there group norms? Are there ways of operating that shape the culture of Rosewood that could be changed, that could help make it better, right? I mean, are there, again, I don't know the interior of the organization well enough to know what those are, but maybe you can think of things that ought to change, right? That would help. So I'll give you an example from my context. I think we as faculty need to spend more time in conversation. That could just be lunch. That would be a cultural norm that I think would have an important effect in the future. So let's keep going. So the last few slides here are sort of summary slides, and we talked about most of these things already, but this is a nice little summary. This is from another Heifetz and Laurie article from Harvard Business Review. So we've already talked about get on the balcony, identify the adaptive challenge. What is the big picture issue at stake? Regulate distress. We haven't talked much about this, but people are going to be stressed out when we're engaging in transformation. So we want to have some stress, but not too much stress. So one of the challenges for leaders, and that doesn't have to be bosses, could be non-boss leaders, peer leaders, is to help people stay calm. That in family systems theory, they talk about being a non-anxious presence. So you're part of an anxious system, but you don't adopt the anxiety of the system. Maintain disciplined attention, so don't get sidetracked. Avoid work avoidance. Work avoidance is behaviors that people engage in, so they're not doing what they're supposed to do.
Oh, come on, James, you are.
Somebody, is that a signal to me to stop talking? I've still got 6 minutes according to my clock. Maintain disciplined attention, so don't get sidetracked. Oh, sorry. So I was talking about work avoidance. Work avoidance is behaviors that people engage in. They may be work behaviors, but they're actually avoiding the real work. So you're busy doing something, or you start a new committee, or you're working on something that's just not that important. Give the work back to the people. So we talked about shared leadership, distributed leadership, and protect the voices of leadership. So those people that speak up and say things, should have the shelter, the confidence that they will, I'm not going to get fired for speaking up. Let's keep going. Adaptive leaders, we talked about many of these things already. So adaptive leaders are people of character, transparency. They are promoting organizational justice. So they're looking out for everybody. They're protecting people. Their development is a part of the process. So reading and learning. And so, part of what you all do, obviously, is these trainings and the webinars and the Tuesday meetings and all the books in the library, and sharing those books and sharing ideas. I mean, that's a critical part of being adaptive leaders. And then emotional intelligence, which we've talked about many times in other webinars, is another characteristic of adaptive leaders. And I think I've got one more slide. So adaptive organizations are places where the elephants in the room are named. That's something I'm really not used to. So here at the university, as I said, it used to be very top down. So nobody would speak up if there was an elephant in the room, unless the president or the senior person in the room brought it up. Again, things have changed now, fortunately. I've worked in churches for many years, and in sort of Black church culture, the pastors are highly revered. So if the pastor doesn't bring it up, nobody else is going to bring it up, which is obviously not very productive, not very helpful. Responsibility for the organization's future is shared. Again, shared leadership. Everybody cares about the organization's future. As I said before, if you don't care about the organization's future, maybe you're in the wrong organization. Independent judgment is expected, so people are not just going along to get along. Leadership capacity is developed, so we're working to help everybody learn how to lead. And reflection and continuous learning are institutionalized. For example, by having Leadership Live once a month. So I think, well, let me read the quote here. It says, people throughout the organization must open themselves to experimentation. And so, I've said it several times now. It's not just about bosses. It's not just about people with formal titles of authority, but adaptive leadership is everybody in the organization being willing to lead, or requires everybody in the organization to be willing to lead. So it's 11:58 or 10:58, excuse me. I'm done. Thoughts, questions, reflections? We got a minute and a half. If anybody else wants to add anything. I hope this was relevant to where you guys are. I'm looking at you, Scott. I see you nodding a little bit.
Yeah, Dr. Fubara, I think my only comment would be in the last, minute here is, adapting and flexibility. There's a compare and contrast there. A lot of times we want to be flexible. We want to be able to flex and adjust, but adaptation really is the true difference is you actually have changed. You've adapted differently. You're not going back to the old ways. Think of it in nature where a species adapts to certain conditions versus a chameleon that just changes its color for that particular short period of time. And so, for us, it's a constant battle between whether we should be disciplined or whether we need to change. Because it's easy just to say, look, it's too hard to kind of follow the rules or to adhere to the standards. So we're just going to adapt. We're just going to make things easier. We're just going to change because it's easier to change in some cases than it is to be held to a standard. So just that contrast between adaptation and flexibility.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I mean, holding those two things in tension, right? Keeping what works and what's core and what's essential and holding on to that, and at the same time changing where needed. But I think that's very helpful. It's 11 o'clock. So
Any other questions for anybody? If there's any questions that come towards marketing, we'll send them your way, Dr. Edward Fubara. But thank you so much. I like your analogy, the balcony. I know dealing with sports growing up and playing sports, our coaches or my dad will film at the top of the bleachers, or they'll have the little sky route to do the aerial view, because you see a lot of different elements or components or just kind of things that you can't see looking at it straight ahead. And I know with me and my team, when we do a lot of editing and designing, everybody gets a piece of it and everybody catches something or sees something different. So we're very diverse here, and we kind of pride ourselves to doing that, and we kind of work together. And when we work together, we kind of get the perfect piece for each element that we have in our design work. I appreciate the insights. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that feedback.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you for joining the July Leadership Live. We'll end up finishing up passing our pins out for Q2. And please tell any of your team members that missed this. And Taylor will also be reaching out to everybody who's completed 2 out of the 3 or 1 out of the 3 for Q2 and Q1, so we can get these pins going. So be part of the team, and let's finish up getting all 12 of them for the rest of the year. So I appreciate it, guys. Thank you, everybody, for joining in July's Leadership Live. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye,
Take care,
everybody.
Antonio. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Fubara.
you.
Thank you.